they like independent?
They were, there was no league. They were independent and they played one another. They had a very organized structure, but there was no formal league.
There was no like commissioner that was like the overhead of that.
That's right, yeah. But what made that fascinating is that, so at the very beginning, these teams were club teams, and they were more interested in the camaraderie and community building, because the YMCA, where basketball was invented, was more interested in, the let's say, preventing young men from moral decay, in the winter, because there was nothing to do in the winter. So they invented this sport, and black basketball and black leaders adopted it and said, look, this is a great way to stay busy because we also have a lot of disease in cities from overcrowding. This is 1910s, 1920s. But more and more, they started to realize with music and with basketball, there were lots of people that were interested, even back in the 1910s. And of course, if you charge money, now there's lots of money being made, and the players eventually said, wait a minute, what about sharing some of the revenue from the tickets?
Yeah.
So then it became a semi-pro sport, and then eventually professional when they had a full year guaranteed contract for players.
Right. How did they recruit their players? Was it just like pick up games in the streets and then they say, okay, you're good, come over to the New York Rams?
No, I mean, there was something like that. I mean, at the beginning, the clubs were more affiliated with organizations. So, for example, in Harlem, there was a church called St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church, which was one of the top, most exclusive elite black churches in the country. And they had a church in Harlem, and their congregation was made up of people that they wanted to attract in, and so they created a youth athletic department. And in that youth athletic area called the St. Christopher Club, they created a basketball team.
Right.
And so that team was mostly people from that church, just as an example. And meanwhile, should we cut?
Yeah.
So these teams, I mean, they started out as clubs, amateur clubs that were really just trying to build camaraderie for maybe it was a social club, could have been a church or another organization that was an athletic club. YMCA's had teams, churches had teams. There were a couple of social clubs that were not exclusively, but predominantly for blacks. At that time, blacks were not allowed in social or athletic clubs, so they had to form their own. And out of those, they created basketball teams because that was a way to get people to come to the game.
Right.
And right around 1910, the phonograph and the radio became commercially available. So that meant that jazz and blues and ragtime became really popular as art forms. Previous to this, they had they were just sheet music that people could play on their piano. But after that, people wanted to see the actual live orchestra or the band. And these enterprising black basketball promoters said, okay, wait, now we have a place to go where these ballrooms that were being built for the music, some nights they were empty. So on the nights that they were empty, they would say, okay, we'll use it for basketball. And by the way, we'll bring in one of these orchestras and bands that were becoming popular. So that's how music became part of basketball. It was really an innovation among African Americans in the 1910s. And so they would play, before the game, during halftime, after the game, and there was a dance. So that's why all these advertisements from those old days, it says basketball and dance. And the dance part was important because blacks were migrating from the South and they were coming to the cities. So this was a way, for the first time ever, for them to meet somebody from their state, from North Carolina or from Louisiana. And it was the first social networking because you could find out what's going on back home, where are the jobs, what should I look out for. So they became meaningful social events. It wasn't just basketball. So basketball always from the beginning was much more than than just for the game. And it definitely wasn't for the money. It was really for a bigger community cause.
Yeah.
And so we try to tap into that, you know, with the stories of these teams and these pioneers, because that's the part that we need most today.
How can we picture the average basketball player of that age? Like what background, education, how tall were they, or
And what was
stuff
the
like
average
that?
age?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so it's interesting that you asked that. Of course, everyone back then, all humans, I think, were shorter. But a lot of these players, you know, they were 5'9", you know,
Right.
5'10", and they didn't have. Some of the rules were different. So, for example, up until about 1915 or even later, if you had dribbled the ball, you couldn't shoot anymore.
Oh,
It disqualified you from
yeah,
shooting.
yeah.
Also, it was either or.
Either or. Well, you could dribble, but then at the last second, I have to pass that off.
Yeah.
So because the YMCA started as it's, you know, camaraderie and teamwork and team spirit. So sharing was one of the things that and it's a good exercise even today. Sometimes when we go to a school, I say, okay, look, we're going to play now with different rules.
Right.
So that one kid who knows all the moves and behind his back and the crossover, like he can't be the ball hog anymore.
Yeah.
Now he's got to give it up. And maybe that's another kid over here who's maybe shy,
Right.
maybe didn't quite, but now he takes a shot, you know, and then that's his goal. So that was one thing that was different. The other thing is that they used to play the whole game inside of a cage, because at one point, if the ball went out of bounds, the team that got to it first got possession of the ball.
Right.
So it would be like a big fight, you know, if you can just imagine, right? So they had to protect the fans, and they also had to protect the players because the fans would get very excited, and you know, there were legends of fans with cigars that would burn. They would burn you, you know, if you were up against the cage. So you know, so that was those two things helped determine also what kinds of players, because after each made basket, remember the basket at first was closed at the bottom. So the referee had to tip the cage or the basket, or it used to be a peach basket, but tip over the scavet,
Yeah.
right? And then all of a sudden that meant you had to have a jump ball after each made basket at center court. So the center was not necessarily always the biggest player. He was just the person that could jump the highest. Because if you could jump the highest and get possession, technically speaking, you could have a shutout.
Yeah.
Because you could possess every single possession could be yours. You score, you come back, you score. There were low scoring games. Sometimes it was 25 to 18. You know, they
Yeah,
didn't start getting. You know,
There was no shot clock.
there was no shot clock. That's right. And there was a premium for players that could shoot from the outside, and of course ball movement. And so the typical player back then, because you didn't know where you were going to play or what kind of conditions, they always had body armor. So they had knee pads, elbow pads typically,
Right.
because you didn't know if there was going to be a wooden floor, other kind of surface. You could have nails, you could have splinters, you could have uneven, you know, floorboarding, and so you just had no idea. So there was that, and plus it was also a rough game. I mean, you could get, you know, decked, you know, any time. So they had back then. The technology of sports apparel was different too. So instead of having, you know, a nice knitted, you know, polyester or something like that, they didn't have polyester. It was all wool. So the jerseys and uniforms and anything that was knitted, the warm-ups were wool. If you look at the old images, their wool shawl collar, they have, you know, that's their warm-up. That's their shooting top. So some of these long sleeves, you know, that you see here, they're reminiscent of the shooting shirt, or what we used to call the cage shirt, because in the cage, just to keep from getting burned and scraped up, that was what these players, you know, could have worn, and so they were what John Isaacs told me is that the actual game uniform, since it was wool, players always had to bring two of them. One to wear, and typically they weren't allowed to shower and change, and you know, it wasn't all fancy. You just get out of here sometimes. You have to run out of the town. And they would hang that up in the bus to dry in the air as they were driving to the next game. Then you eventually you get to a place where you can wash it and put it up. But he also said that this was wool with a button crotch. So that was, if you look at the old photos, they always have like a belt buckle, short shorts. Then you wonder how did that ever stay all together? It's because the crotch has the buttons on it, like with the babies, like a onesie.
Right.
So the diaper to keep everything together. So that's how they typically were, and so we try to celebrate that as much as we can, with some of the apparel, the designs. I think they did a great job. This particular apparel collection is first of its kind in many ways in the industry, and so I'm really proud of what they did. 47, they did a tremendous job.
About the events that took place, like the teams traveling around the country and playing the games in different cities. Did white people come there? Was it like kind of a contact zone between different races, people of different backgrounds, or even though there were only black players, did white people participate in any kind of way in these events?
Yes. So the fascinating thing is that it was probably mostly white people, mostly Caucasians that came to these games. Because if you think about it, let's just pick a city, Oshkosh, Wisconsin, which, by the way, has a big German history, and so it's approximately 100% white town. These towns in the Midwest, and the Wrens or some of these other teams that would travel around would go to those towns and play. And they would get 1,000, 2,000 fans. Pittsburgh, 6,000 sometimes. And what people did is they would come to see this game because, in a certain way, it was a racial game, because it was the black team against the white team.
Right.
And white people wanted to see that. And even if sometimes they had black spectators, sometimes they had to sit in a different section, and sometimes they didn't have to, because it's just mixed. You just go.
Right.
And but the majority of the ticket buyers were Caucasian, because there just weren't enough of blacks in that town or in that city at the beginning. So it evolved. So at first it was that these were rivalries between two black teams, and they would travel around, and most of the spectators would be black.
Right.
Because, for example, you had an all-black team from Pittsburgh playing an all-black team from New York, in New York, and most of the people that went were had an allegiance or somehow were fans of that club or this club or that church or this church. But as it became a money-building opportunity, they started to realize that we can take this team and play against the top white team from that town. So in Pittsburgh, for example, the Monticello Athletic Association, which eventually became this other team, the Lowendai Big Five, Cumberland Posey, who was the head of that team, he realized we can play the Coffee Club, which was this all-Jewish team, and everyone would come because it was racial hysteria. But behind the scenes, it was all like, hey, we shook hands, right? It was like, hey, we shook hands. You have to shake hands because we're friends. Now let's put on this thing. It's a little bit like if you go to see Straight Outta Compton.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
Most of the fans were white.
We were white, right.
Most of the people who bought the music were white. So you realize, okay, we're going out, we're making a deal, and that's one of the lessons. One of the lessons is, let's collaborate. Let's find a way to come together. The common ground is basketball, and also we love of the game, and the culture was mixed, really. I mean, especially in the North. This was the one area, sports, where people came together a lot, and in many cases, that was sometimes the only black people that those white fans had ever seen. It was the first time. So it made folks realize, hey, you know what, like all these things we read in the newspaper, it's not really necessarily true, all these things that they're saying. So I give a lot of credit to these traveling basketball teams. And as I said, as it became a bigger and bigger game with more money involved, then most of the spectators were white, but then it became more colorblind too, because they started to realize, even with the World Championship in 1939, that was a big newspaper in Chicago that decided, all right, let's have this World Championship because everyone claims to be champions. But let's find out once and for all. And they invited the 12 top teams, including 2 black teams. And there were always black teams invited to that, which you could have easily said, let's not invite the black team. But it would have been so fake. It would have been such a falsehood, it would have been just, it wouldn't have been real, and everybody knew it. And it's because these teams had already been touring around and everybody knew them. And it would have been probably the white fans who would have said, where are the Reds?
Right.
Where are these teams? So we sometimes think that prior to the civil rights era, there was everything was Jim Crow, everything was racist, everything was exclusionary, but actually it wasn't always that way. And so the things that we read about that were terrible truly were atrocious, but there were there were slivers of light in there that helped to make this basketball evolve, and at the same time pave the way for the NBA.